The most powerful move you can make with difficult people isn't to argue louder. It's to protect your energy, set your boundaries, and let your silence speak for you. Dealing with difficult people, stay calm, set boundaries, and stay in control. Before we dive in, hit like and subscribe if you enjoy the books I publish here. Comment where you're listening from and the time there, it's always cool to see. Now, listen, grow, and hopefully you fall asleep. Chapter 1. The Emotional Revolution in Human Relations. You may have thought that dealing with difficult people was simply about having the right words to say, but it's ironic that the most challenging conversations often happen when we're least prepared for them. How is it that we have more communication tips and tricks, conflict resolution tools and techniques, self-help books and seminars than ever before, and yet we still find ourselves overwhelmed by difficult personalities? How is it that we know more about psychology and human behavior today, and yet workplace stress and relationship conflicts are at an all-time high? The reason why is because everything you know about managing difficult people is fundamentally incomplete. I first started to realize this a couple of years ago during what should have been a routine team meeting. I was working with a marketing manager who had a reputation for being particularly challenging. She had this way of questioning every decision, undermining suggestions with passive-aggressive comments, and creating tension that seemed to spread through the entire room like wildfire. As I watched her systematically dismantle a colleague's presentation with subtle but cutting remarks, I noticed something fascinating. The presenter, a talented software engineer, began to mirror her energy. His voice became defensive, his posture shifted, and within minutes, what started as a productive discussion had devolved into a thinly veiled argument. In that moment, I realized two crucial things. First, that traditional advice about staying professional and not taking things personally completely misses the mark. Second, that even though everything we've been taught about handling difficult people focuses on external strategies like communication techniques, scripts, and behavioral modifications, what I witnessed was something far more fundamental. The real challenge isn't logical at all. Today, managing difficult people is no longer just about having the right responses. Today, it's about understanding the emotional dynamics that drive these interactions and how our feelings of frustration, anxiety, fear, and overwhelm dictate our reactions as much as any communication strategy we might employ. Here's what most people don't understand about difficult personalities. There is no such thing as people management. You can't manage other people's behavior. People will continue to act according to their own motivations, triggers, and patterns whether we like it or not. So there is no such thing as people management. Really, there is only self-management in the face of challenging behavior. That was my first major breakthrough. But to understand the second, I need to take you through the evolution of how we've approached difficult relationships, because this journey reveals why traditional methods often fail and what actually works. The early approaches to handling difficult people, dating back to the industrial era of management, were one-dimensional and focused entirely on efficiency. The thinking was simple. If we could develop better communication tools and techniques to handle conflicts faster, then theoretically we'd have fewer problems and more productive relationships. There's nothing inherently wrong with efficiency in communication. All things being equal, resolving conflicts quickly is better than letting them fester. Yet there's a significant limitation to efficiency as a strategy for managing difficult people. And it's evidenced by the fact that despite having access to countless communication frameworks and conflict resolution models, we still find ourselves repeatedly struggling with the same challenging personalities. In the late 80s, a second wave of thinking emerged, largely influenced by emotional intelligence research and advanced psychology. This introduced what we might call two-dimensional thinking about difficult people. We learned to consider both the urgency of addressing problematic behavior and the importance of the relationship itself. This gave us frameworks for categorizing difficult people and prioritizing which conflicts to address first. We learned to ask questions like, how urgent is this behavior? And how important is this relationship to my goals? The beauty of this approach was that it provided a systematic way to evaluate our responses and decide where to invest our emotional energy. Prioritizing which difficult people to engage with and which conflicts to address first has been the dominant approach for the last 2 decades. It's not that there's anything wrong with this strategy. In fact, prioritizing remains as valuable a skill today as it ever has been. We throw around phrases like, pick your battles and don't let them get to you, as if they're the ultimate solutions to managing challenging relationships. But here's the massive limitation that nobody talks about. There's nothing about prioritizing difficult people that actually changes their behavior or reduces the emotional toll they take on you. All prioritizing does is help you decide which conflicts to engage with first, which is valuable in itself, but it doesn't inherently create more peace in your life or help you develop the resilience to handle multiple challenging personalities simultaneously. If you think about efficiency-based approaches, it's like running on a hamster wheel, trying to resolve conflicts faster and faster. If you think about prioritizing difficult people, it's really about emotional juggling, borrowing energy from one relationship to invest in another. That's why we use phrases like, I'm juggling a lot of personalities, or I'm trying to balance all these different people. In that paradigm, there are only 2 strategies: handle conflicts faster or handle more conflicts. And that's exactly what modern workplace relationships feel like, isn't it? How does it feel to know that we're essentially juggling hamsters, sprinting toward an inevitable emotional crash? You cannot solve today's relationship challenges with yesterday's people management thinking. What I've discovered is the emergence of a new type of person, someone I call a boundary multiplier. Boundary multipliers use what I call 3-dimensional thinking. While most people make decisions about difficult personalities based only on urgency and importance, boundary multipliers make a third calculation based on significance. If urgency is how soon does this behavior need to be addressed, and importance is how much does this relationship matter to my immediate goals, then significance is how long will the impact of this interaction matter. It's a completely different paradigm. It builds on traditional approaches while introducing something revolutionary. Because most of us, when we encounter difficult behavior, ask ourselves, what's the most important thing I can do right now to handle this situation? But that's not how boundary multipliers think. Instead, boundary multipliers ask, what can I do today that would make tomorrow's interactions with this person better? What boundary can I establish right now that would make future encounters more manageable? They're making the significance calculation. When I say multiply your emotional energy, that might sound like an exaggeration, but it's not. Now, it's true that we all have the same amount of emotional capacity in any given day. There's a finite amount of stress we can handle, patience we can maintain, and conflicts we can navigate. There's nothing any of us can do to create more emotional bandwidth in a single day. But that's exactly the problem. That type of thinking is the problem. We have to break out of that paradigm and instead think about tomorrow, next week, next month. That brings us to the fundamental premise for how you multiply your emotional energy and create lasting change in difficult relationships. The way you multiply your emotional energy is simple. You give yourself permission to invest energy today in strategies that will reduce the emotional toll of difficult people tomorrow. That's the significance calculation. You multiply your emotional resilience by giving yourself permission to spend energy today on boundaries and systems that create more peace tomorrow. The significance calculation changes everything when dealing with difficult people. Chapter 2. The Relationship Funnel Framework. The relationship funnel is my attempt to create a visual framework that captures the thought process boundary multipliers use when evaluating how to respond to difficult people. It's why some individuals seem to effortlessly navigate challenging personalities, while others get caught in endless cycles of conflict and frustration. Picture all your interactions with difficult people flowing into the top of a funnel. The first question a boundary multiplier asks isn't, how do I respond to this behavior? Instead, they ask, can I eliminate this interaction entirely? Is engaging with this person even necessary? This is another example of how everything you know about managing difficult people needs updating. Most of us operate from a default assumption that we must engage with every challenging person in our environment. We feel obligated to respond to every provocative comment, address every unreasonable demand, and participate in every conflict that presents itself. Boundary multipliers realize that next-generation relationship management has much more to do with what interactions you don't engage in than what you do engage in. They understand that perfection in relationships is achieved not when you can handle every difficult person perfectly, but when you've eliminated unnecessary exposure to toxic behavior. This is what I call the permission to ignore. Because anything we choose not to engage with today creates more emotional energy for us tomorrow. The emotional challenge is that we struggle with guilt. We feel like we're being rude, unprofessional, or avoiding our responsibilities when we choose not to respond to difficult behavior. But here's what changed my perspective completely. In an interview with a highly successful executive who seemed immune to workplace drama, she said something profound. It's futile to go through life trying to never ignore anyone. What you have to realize is that you're always ignoring someone. Because anytime you choose to engage with one difficult person, you're simultaneously choosing not to engage with countless others. Every moment you spend managing someone's unreasonable behavior is a moment you're not investing in positive relationships or productive activities. If you can't eliminate the interaction entirely, the next question is, can I automate my response to this behavior? Anything I create a systematic response for today saves me emotional energy tomorrow. Think about it like setting up an email autoresponder. You might not have the mental bandwidth right now to create a structured approach for handling a chronically complaining colleague, but a boundary multiplier realizes that if developing a consistent response system saves them 30 minutes of emotional processing each week, then it makes sense to invest the time up front to create that system. After just a few weeks, you'll have broken even on that emotional investment, and every interaction thereafter will require less mental energy. This is what I call ROEI, return on emotional investment. Automation in relationships is to your emotional energy exactly what compound interest is to your money. Just like compound interest takes money and turns it into more money, systematic responses take emotional energy and turn it into more emotional energy. The way that emotionally wealthy people think about their energy is exactly the same way that boundary multipliers think about their interactions. They give themselves permission to invest time and energy upfront to create systems that will serve them long term. If an interaction can't be eliminated or automated, then the question becomes, can it be delegated? Can I teach someone else how to handle this person or situation? I'm reminded of a situation early in my career when I was dealing with a particularly demanding client who had a habit of calling with urgent requests that weren't actually urgent. These calls would derail my entire day and leave me feeling frustrated and behind on important projects. Initially, I felt like I had to handle every call personally because I was the account manager. But then I realized I could train a junior team member to field these calls, assess the true urgency, and either handle the request directly or schedule appropriate follow-up time with me. The first few times I had to coach my colleague through the process. Yes, there were some awkward moments as they learned to navigate this client's personality, but within a month they had developed their own effective approach and I was freed up to focus on higher value activities. Most people resist delegation when it comes to difficult personalities because they think they just can't handle this person as well as I can. And that might be true initially, but it's only true if you ignore the significance calculation. If you think longer term, you realize that other people can develop the skills to manage challenging personalities just like you did. Significance changes everything. It's how you multiply your emotional energy. It's giving yourself permission to accept imperfect handling of difficult people for a little while, because over time, others will develop their own effective approaches. If you can't eliminate, automate, or delegate an interaction with a difficult person, that interaction drops out the bottom of the funnel. At that point, there's only one question. Should I address this behavior now? Must it be dealt with immediately, or can it wait until later? If the behavior must be addressed now, that's what we call concentrate. It's the permission to protect your boundaries in the moment. It's about focus and eliminating distractions from your core message. Honestly, there's nothing particularly revolutionary about this concept. It's traditional conflict resolution. Stay calm, be direct, Focus on specific behaviors rather than personality traits. However, if you ask yourself, can this wait until later? And decide the answer is yes, then that's not eliminate, automate, or delegate. That's what I call strategic patience. Now, you're not going to wait forever. You're going to cycle that interaction back to the top of the funnel, where it will enter a holding pattern, moving through the relationship funnel until eventually one of the other 4 strategies becomes the right approach. What you often find is that if something can continually wait, you develop the courage to do what you should have done in the first place, which was eliminate it entirely. Or you discover a systematic way to automate your response. Or someone else steps up and takes ownership of managing that difficult relationship. Or the situation evolves to the point where direct engagement becomes truly necessary and worthwhile. Many people ask me, but doesn't this approach seem passive-aggressive? Aren't you just avoiding conflict? And I understand the concern. There's a crucial distinction to make here. There's a difference between avoiding something we know we should address because we don't feel like dealing with it versus waiting to address something because we've decided that now is not the optimal time. Avoiding necessary conversations because we're uncomfortable is conflict avoidance, and that's destructive to relationships. But waiting to engage because we've strategically determined that the timing isn't right, that's not avoidance. That's not destructive. That's a virtue, and it's an art form that our hyper-connected world desperately needs. The patience to delay engaging with insignificant provocations. Like responding to every passive-aggressive email within minutes, or feeling compelled to correct every unreasonable statement in a meeting. You multiply your emotional energy by giving yourself permission to invest energy today in strategies that create more peace tomorrow. The relationship funnel isn't just a framework for managing others. It's a complete paradigm shift in how we think about our emotional resources and the relationships that either drain or energize us. Chapter 3. The permission to ignore. The most revolutionary concept in modern relationship management isn't learning how to handle difficult people better. It's learning when not to handle them at all. This is what I call the permission to ignore, and it's the foundation of emotional multiplication. Most of us have been conditioned to believe that ignoring difficult behavior is unprofessional, rude, or irresponsible. We've been taught that good people, successful people, mature people always engage. They always respond. They always try to work things out. This conditioning is not only wrong, it's emotionally destructive. Let me share a story that illustrates this perfectly. A few years ago, I was consulting with a technology company where a senior developer had become notorious for derailing meetings with tangential complaints and personal grievances. Every team gathering would inevitably become about his frustrations with management, his disagreements with project priorities, or his theories about what was wrong with the company culture. The team leader, a brilliant woman with exceptional technical skills, had been trying for months to manage this behavior. She would redirect conversations, schedule separate one-on-one meetings to address his concerns, and spend hours crafting diplomatic responses to his disruptive comments. When I asked her why she felt compelled to engage with every outburst, she said something that revealed the core problem. I feel like if I don't respond, I'm not doing my job as a leader. I'm supposed to address these issues. But here's what she hadn't considered. By consistently engaging with his disruptive behavior, she was actually reinforcing it. She was teaching him that interrupting meetings and voicing complaints was an effective way to get attention and control the agenda. Her well-intentioned responses were inadvertently encouraging the very behavior she wanted to stop. The permission to ignore doesn't mean being dismissive or disrespectful. It means making strategic decisions about where to invest your emotional energy based on the significance calculation. It means recognizing that some behaviors don't deserve a response and that your attention is a valuable resource that should be allocated intentionally. When we implemented the relationship funnel approach, the transformation was remarkable. Instead of engaging with every complaint, the team leader began to simply acknowledge disruptive comments with a brief "I hear you," and then immediately redirect the conversation back to the agenda. She stopped scheduling special meetings to address every grievance and instead established regular office hours where team members could discuss concerns privately. Within 3 weeks, the disruptive behavior decreased by approximately 70%. The developer realized that his previous tactics were no longer effective, and he began to adapt his communication style to match the team's more focused approach. This is the power of strategic non-engagement, but it requires overcoming several psychological barriers that keep most people trapped in reactive patterns. The first barrier is the guilt response. We feel guilty when we don't respond to someone who seems upset or frustrated. This guilt is often rooted in childhood conditioning, where we learned that ignoring someone was mean or hurtful. But there's a crucial difference between ignoring someone's legitimate needs and choosing not to engage with manipulative or disruptive behavior. The second barrier is the fear of escalation. We worry that if we don't address difficult behavior immediately, it will get worse. Sometimes this is true, but more often, consistent non-engagement actually de-escalates situations by removing the emotional fuel that feeds problematic behavior. The third barrier is the control illusion. We believe that if we just find the right words, the right approach, the right timing, we can change how difficult people behave. This illusion keeps us trapped in endless cycles of trying to manage other people's emotions and reactions. The permission to ignore is really about accepting a fundamental truth. You cannot control other people's behavior, but you can control your response to it. And sometimes, the most powerful response is no response at all. But strategic non-engagement requires wisdom. You need to distinguish between behavior that deserves attention and behavior that should be ignored. Here are the key criteria I use. First, is this behavior directly impacting productivity or team dynamics in a measurable way? If someone's actions are preventing work from getting done or creating a hostile environment for others, that typically requires engagement. Second, is this a pattern of behavior or an isolated incident? Isolated incidents often resolve themselves without intervention, while patterns may need to be addressed systematically. Third, does this person have the authority or influence to create significant consequences if their behavior isn't addressed? Sometimes we need to engage with difficult behavior simply because of organizational realities. Fourth, is there a reasonable expectation that engagement will lead to positive change? If someone has consistently shown that they don't respond well to feedback or attempts at resolution, continued engagement may be counterproductive. The permission to ignore also extends to digital communications. How many hours do we waste crafting careful responses to passive-aggressive emails? How much emotional energy do we spend analyzing the tone of text messages or trying to decode the meaning behind someone's social media posts? A boundary multiplier approaches digital communication with the same strategic mindset. They ask, does this message require a response? Or is someone simply venting their frustrations into the digital void? They recognize that not every email needs a reply, not every comment needs a response, and not every provocation needs to be addressed. I learned this lesson the hard way during a particularly challenging project where a stakeholder would send long, rambling emails filled with complaints and accusations, often copying multiple people to maximize the drama. Initially, I felt compelled to respond to every point, defend my team's work, and try to address his concerns comprehensively. These responses would take hours to craft and would inevitably lead to even longer, more accusatory emails in return. The cycle was exhausting and unproductive. Finally, I decided to implement a strategic non-engagement approach. I began responding only to specific, actionable requests buried within his emotional outbursts. I ignored the complaints, the accusations, and the dramatic language. I simply extracted any legitimate business needs and addressed those with brief professional responses. The change was immediate and dramatic. Without the emotional fuel of my defensive responses, his emails became shorter and more focused. Eventually, he began communicating more professionally because he learned that emotional manipulation wasn't an effective way to get my attention. This experience taught me that the permission to ignore isn't about being cold or uncaring. It's about refusing to participate in unproductive emotional dynamics. It's about maintaining your own emotional equilibrium so you can be more effective in the interactions that truly matter. The permission to ignore is ultimately about respect for your own time, energy, and emotional well-being, and paradoxically, respect for others by refusing to enable their worst behaviors. When you stop rewarding difficult behavior with your attention, you create space for better behavior to emerge. When you stop participating in drama, you model a more professional way of interacting. When you stop trying to manage other people's emotions, you free up energy to focus on what you can actually control. The permission to ignore is not a license to be dismissive or unprofessional. It's a strategic tool for creating healthier relationship dynamics and protecting your emotional resources so you can be more effective where it truly matters. Chapter 4: The Automation of Emotional Responses. The second strategy in the relationship funnel is automation, and it represents one of the most powerful tools for multiplying your emotional energy when dealing with difficult people. Just as we automate financial transactions to save time and reduce errors, we can automate our emotional responses to create consistency and reduce the mental energy required to navigate challenging personalities. Most people approach each difficult interaction as if it's completely unique, requiring them to reinvent their response strategy every single time. This approach is emotionally exhausting and often leads to inconsistent results. A boundary multiplier, however, recognizes patterns in difficult behavior and develops systematic responses that can be applied consistently across similar situations. Let me illustrate this with a story about a marketing director I worked with who was struggling with a chronically negative team member. This individual had a predictable pattern. Every Monday morning, he would arrive at the office and spend the first hour of the team meeting cataloging everything that had gone wrong the previous week, why current projects were doomed to fail, and how management didn't understand the challenges the team was facing. Initially, the marketing director would try to address each complaint individually, offering solutions, explanations, or reassurances. These responses would often lead to longer discussions about why the solutions wouldn't work, which would derail the entire meeting and set a negative tone for the week. After implementing the automation strategy, she developed what we called a pattern interrupt protocol. Whenever the negative team member began his weekly litany of complaints, she would use a consistent, predetermined response. I can see you have concerns about several issues. Let's schedule 15 minutes after this meeting to discuss the top 2 priorities, and I'll need you to come with specific suggestions for improvement. This automated response accomplished several things simultaneously. It acknowledged his concerns without allowing them to dominate the meeting. It set a clear boundary around the time and format for addressing issues, and it shifted the responsibility from complaining to problem solving. The beauty of this approach was that it removed the emotional labor of deciding how to respond in the moment. The marketing director no longer had to think through her options, weigh different approaches, or worry about saying the wrong thing. She had a predetermined, tested response that she could deploy consistently. Within a month, the negative team member's behavior began to change. He realized that his previous strategy of monopolizing meeting time with complaints was no longer effective. He started coming to their scheduled discussions with more thoughtful, solution-oriented input. The Monday morning meetings became more productive, and the overall team dynamic improved significantly. This is the power of emotional automation. But creating effective automated responses requires understanding the psychology behind difficult behavior and designing systems that address the underlying needs without reinforcing problematic patterns. The first step in automation is pattern recognition. Most difficult people are remarkably consistent in their behavior. They use the same triggers, follow the same emotional scripts, and respond to situations in predictable ways. Once you identify these patterns, you can develop targeted responses that address the behavior systematically. For example, if you're dealing with someone who frequently interrupts meetings with off-topic questions, you can develop an automated response like, "That's an interesting point that deserves proper attention. Let's add it to our parking lot and make sure we address it before the end of the meeting." This response acknowledges their input, prevents the derailment, and creates a structured way to address their concern. If you're dealing with someone who sends passive-aggressive emails, you can create an automated response template that focuses only on actionable items while ignoring the emotional content. Thanks for your message. I see 3 action items here. I'll handle items 1 and 2 by Friday and will need clarification on item 3. Let me know if I've missed anything important. The key to effective automation is creating responses that are professional, consistent, and focused on moving situations forward rather than getting caught in emotional dynamics. These responses should be practiced until they become natural, so you can deploy them without having to think through your options in emotionally charged moments. But automation goes beyond just verbal responses. You can automate your entire approach to certain types of difficult interactions. For instance, if you regularly deal with people who make unreasonable demands, you can develop a standard process, acknowledge the request, ask for specific details and timelines. Explain your current priorities and constraints, and offer alternative solutions or compromises. This systematic approach removes the emotional burden of having to negotiate from scratch every time someone makes an unreasonable request. You have a proven process that protects your boundaries while maintaining professional relationships. One of the most powerful applications of automation is in email communication. Difficult people often use email as a weapon, sending long, emotionally charged messages designed to provoke defensive responses. By developing automated email protocols, you can neutralize these tactics while maintaining professional communication. Here's an example of an automated email response system I developed for dealing with accusatory or inflammatory messages. First, I wait at least 2 hours before responding to any emotionally charged email. This prevents reactive responses and gives me time to apply my systematic approach. Second, I use a standard template that acknowledges receipt of their message, identifies any specific actions or information they're requesting, and provides a clear timeline for follow-up. I completely ignore any emotional content, accusations, or inflammatory language. Third, I copy only the people who need to be involved in the actual work, not everyone who was included in the original dramatic email chain. This automated approach has saved me countless hours of emotional energy and has consistently led to more productive outcomes than trying to address every emotional element in difficult communications. The automation strategy also applies to setting boundaries around your availability and communication preferences. Instead of making these decisions in the moment when you're feeling pressured, you can establish clear, consistent policies that you apply automatically. For example, you might automate your response to urgent requests by saying, "I understand this feels urgent to you. My current priority commitments mean I can address this on Thursday afternoon. If this truly can't wait until then, please help me understand what specific consequences we're trying to avoid, and I'll see if I can adjust my schedule." This automated response acknowledges their sense of urgency while protecting your existing commitments and requiring them to justify the true urgency of their request. Most of the time, you'll find that things that feel urgent to others can actually wait, and this systematic approach helps separate genuine emergencies from manufactured crises. The psychological benefit of automation extends beyond just saving time and energy. When you have predetermined responses to difficult behavior, you feel more confident and in control during challenging interactions. You're not scrambling to figure out what to say or worrying about whether you're handling the situation correctly. You have a tested system that you can rely on. This confidence often changes the entire dynamic of difficult relationships. When people realize that their usual tactics don't create the emotional reactions they're accustomed to, they often adjust their behavior to match your more professional approach. However, automation requires regular refinement. As you use your systematic responses, you'll discover what works well and what needs adjustment. You might find that certain phrases are more effective than others, or that some situations require slight modifications to your standard approach. The goal isn't to become robotic or impersonal. The goal is to remove the emotional labor of deciding how to respond to predictable, difficult behavior, so you can save your creative energy for situations that truly require customized approaches. Automation is ultimately about creating emotional efficiency. Just as financial automation allows your money to work for you while you focus on other priorities, emotional automation allows your relationship management systems to work for you while you focus on more important and fulfilling interactions. When you automate your responses to difficult people, you're not avoiding the relationship. You're managing it more effectively by removing the emotional volatility that often makes these interactions unproductive. You're creating space for better behavior to emerge by refusing to participate in the emotional drama that difficult people often use to control situations. The automation strategy transforms difficult relationships from energy drains into manageable, predictable interactions that require minimal emotional investment while still maintaining professional effectiveness. Chapter 5: The Art of Strategic Delegation. The third strategy in the relationship funnel is delegation, and it's perhaps the most underutilized tool for managing difficult people. Most of us assume that if we're having problems with someone, we're the ones who have to solve it. We take personal responsibility for managing every challenging relationship in our sphere as if it's a reflection of our competence or character. This assumption is not only wrong, it's counterproductive. Strategic delegation of difficult relationships can multiply your emotional energy while often leading to better outcomes than trying to handle everything yourself. Let me share a story that perfectly illustrates this principle. Early in my career, I was managing a project that involved coordinating with a vendor who was notoriously difficult to work with. This individual had a reputation for being condescending, making unreasonable demands, and creating unnecessary drama around routine business transactions. Every interaction with this vendor left me feeling frustrated and drained. Phone calls would stretch on for hours as he would lecture me about industry standards, question our company's competence, and make veiled threats about taking his business elsewhere. I dreaded these conversations and found myself procrastinating on necessary communications, which only made the project coordination more challenging. I was convinced that as the project manager, I had to handle this relationship personally. I thought that delegating these interactions would be seen as avoiding my responsibilities or passing off unpleasant tasks to others. Then I had a conversation with a senior colleague who had worked with this vendor previously. She mentioned that she had always assigned a specific team member to handle communications with him, someone who seemed to have a natural ability to manage his personality without getting emotionally triggered. Curious about this approach, I decided to experiment. I introduced this team member as the primary point of contact for routine communications with the vendor, while I remained involved in high-level decisions and project oversight. The results were remarkable. The team member I had chosen had a naturally direct communication style that seemed to neutralize the vendor's tendency toward drama. She would respond to his lectures with brief acknowledgements and then redirect the conversation to specific business needs. She didn't take his condescending tone personally, and she had no patience for unnecessary complications. Within a few weeks, the vendor's behavior with our team had completely changed. He became more professional, more efficient, and significantly easier to work with. The project moved forward smoothly, and I was freed up to focus on other critical aspects of the work. This experience taught me that different people have different natural abilities when it comes to managing challenging personalities. What feels impossible for one person might be relatively easy for another, based on their communication style, emotional triggers, and personal boundaries. Strategic delegation isn't about passing off unpleasant tasks to others. It's about matching the right people with the right challenges based on their natural strengths and abilities. It's about recognizing that you don't have to be good at everything, and that sometimes the best way to handle a difficult person is to not handle them yourself. But effective delegation of difficult relationships requires careful consideration of several factors. First, you need to identify team members who have the right temperament and skills for managing specific types of challenging behavior. Some people are naturally good at dealing with aggressive personalities, while others excel at managing passive-aggressive behavior or chronic complainers. Second, you need to provide proper context and support. When you delegate a difficult relationship, you can't just dump the problem on someone else and walk away. You need to brief them on the history, the patterns of behavior they can expect, and the strategies that have been effective or ineffective in the past. Third, you need to maintain appropriate oversight and be available for consultation when unusual situations arise. Delegation doesn't mean abdication of responsibility. It means strategic allocation of resources based on strengths and capabilities. One of the most effective applications of this strategy is in customer service situations. I worked with a retail company that was struggling with a small group of extremely demanding customers who would monopolize staff time with complaints, unreasonable requests, and emotional outbursts. Instead of requiring every staff member to handle these challenging customers, they identified 2 employees who had exceptional patience and de-escalation skills. These employees became the designated points of contact for the most difficult customers, while other staff members were trained to politely redirect challenging interactions to these specialists. This approach had multiple benefits. The specialist employees developed even stronger skills in managing difficult personalities because they had more practice and could focus their energy on mastering these interactions. The other staff members were protected from emotionally draining encounters that would have negatively impacted their performance with regular customers. And the difficult customers actually received better service because they were being handled by people who were specifically equipped to meet their needs. The delegation strategy also works in family situations. If you have a relative who consistently creates drama at family gatherings, you might identify another family member who has a natural ability to manage their behavior and ask them to take the lead in those interactions. For example, if your uncle always starts political arguments at family dinners, and your cousin has a talent for redirecting conversations with humor and changing subjects gracefully, you might coordinate with your cousin to have them sit near your uncle and take the lead in managing those potential conflicts. This isn't about manipulating family dynamics or avoiding your responsibilities. It's about recognizing that different people have different strengths and that leveraging those strengths can create better outcomes for everyone involved. In workplace settings, delegation can be particularly effective when dealing with difficult clients or vendors. Instead of having the same person repeatedly struggle with a challenging external relationship, you can rotate responsibilities or assign the relationship to someone whose communication style is a better match. I've seen situations where a client who was impossible for one account manager to work with became completely manageable when transferred to a different team member who had a more compatible personality and communication approach. The key insight here is that difficult behavior isn't always about the person being difficult. Sometimes it's about a mismatch in communication styles, personality types, or emotional triggers. What creates conflict between 2 people might not create any problems at all between different individuals. Strategic delegation also provides valuable learning opportunities for team members who want to develop their skills in managing challenging relationships. By pairing less experienced team members with those who have proven abilities in this area, you can create mentoring relationships that build organizational capacity for handling difficult people. However, delegation requires careful attention to fairness and workload distribution. You can't consistently assign all the difficult relationships to the same person without providing appropriate recognition, compensation, or support. People who are naturally good at managing challenging personalities shouldn't be penalized for their abilities by being given a disproportionate share of difficult interactions. One effective approach is to create rotation systems where different team members take turns handling challenging relationships, with those who have proven abilities serving as mentors and backup support for others who are developing these skills. The delegation strategy also extends to seeking external support when internal resources aren't sufficient. Sometimes the best way to handle a difficult person is to bring in a neutral third party who can manage the relationship without the emotional baggage that might have developed through previous interactions. This might involve hiring a consultant to manage a challenging client relationship, bringing in a mediator to resolve ongoing conflicts, or working with human resources to address problematic employee behavior. The psychological benefit of strategic delegation is significant. When you realize that you don't have to personally manage every difficult relationship in your environment, it reduces the emotional burden and stress that comes from feeling responsible for other people's behavior. It also allows you to focus your energy on the relationships and interactions where you can be most effective, rather than getting drained by situations that don't play to your natural strengths. Strategic delegation is ultimately about building systems and leveraging resources to create better outcomes with less personal, emotional investment. It's about recognizing that managing difficult people is a skill set, and like any skill set, different people have different levels of natural ability and developed expertise. When you delegate difficult relationships strategically, you're not avoiding responsibility. you're taking responsibility for creating the most effective possible outcomes by matching challenges with the people who are best equipped to handle them. This approach multiplies your emotional energy by freeing you from interactions that drain you unnecessarily, while often producing better results than you could achieve through direct engagement. It's a win-win strategy that benefits everyone involved, including the difficult people who receive more effective management of their challenging behavior. Chapter 6. The Power of Strategic Patience. The fourth and final strategy in the relationship funnel is what I call strategic patience, and it's perhaps the most misunderstood concept in modern relationship management. Most people confuse strategic patience with avoidance, procrastination, or passive-aggressive behavior. But true strategic patience is an active choice based on the significance calculation, a deliberate decision to delay engagement because the timing isn't optimal for productive resolution. Strategic patience recognizes that not every difficult behavior needs to be addressed immediately, and that sometimes waiting for the right moment can lead to far better outcomes than rushing into confrontation when emotions are high or circumstances are unfavorable. Let me illustrate this with a story about a situation that taught me the profound difference between avoidance and strategic patience. I was working with a team where two senior members had developed an ongoing conflict that was affecting the entire group's productivity. The tension between them was palpable during meetings. They would make subtle digs at each other's ideas, and their disagreement was starting to polarize other team members. My initial instinct was to address this conflict immediately. I felt like, as a leader, I needed to call a meeting, get everything out in the open, and work toward resolution. But something held me back. Both individuals were under significant stress from external factors. One was dealing with a family medical crisis, and the other was in the middle of a major project deadline that had been moved up unexpectedly. Instead of forcing a confrontation during this already stressful period, I decided to wait. I continued to monitor the situation, made sure their conflict wasn't escalating to the point where it would cause serious damage, and looked for a better opportunity to address the underlying issues. 3 weeks later, both external stressors had resolved. The family medical situation had stabilized, and the rushed project had been completed successfully. At that point, I approached each individual separately to discuss the team dynamics and their working relationship. The conversations were completely different from what they would have been during the crisis period. Both people were more reflective, more open to feedback, and more willing to take responsibility for their part in the conflict. We were able to address the underlying issues constructively and develop strategies for better collaboration moving forward. If I had forced the conversation during the high-stress period, it likely would have escalated the conflict and created lasting damage to their working relationship. By exercising strategic patience, I was able to achieve a much better outcome with significantly less emotional drama. This experience taught me that timing is crucial when dealing with difficult people and challenging situations. There are moments when people are receptive to feedback and willing to engage constructively, and there are moments when any attempt at resolution will only make things worse. Strategic patience is about recognizing these different moments and choosing to engage when the conditions are most favorable for positive outcomes. It's about understanding that your emotional energy is a finite resource, and that investing it at the right time can produce exponentially better results than rushing into confrontation when the timing is poor. But strategic patience requires wisdom and careful judgment. You need to distinguish between situations that will improve with time and situations that will deteriorate if left unaddressed. You need to recognize when waiting is strategic and when it's simply avoidance disguised as patience. Here are the key criteria I use to determine when strategic patience is appropriate. First, are the underlying stresses temporary or permanent? If someone is behaving badly because they're dealing with a temporary crisis, strategic patience often makes sense. If their difficult behavior is part of a long-term pattern unrelated to external circumstances, waiting may not lead to improvement. Second, is the difficult behavior escalating or remaining stable? If someone's problematic actions are getting worse over time, immediate intervention may be necessary. If the behavior is consistent but not escalating, you may have the luxury of waiting for better timing. Third, are there external factors that are likely to change in the near future? If you know that organizational changes, project completions, or personal circumstances are likely to shift the dynamics, it may make sense to wait for those changes before addressing relationship issues. Fourth, do you have the emotional bandwidth to handle the situation effectively right now? If you're dealing with your own stress or challenges, it may be better to wait until you can approach the situation from a position of strength and clarity. Strategic patience also applies to choosing the right communication channels and settings for difficult conversations. Sometimes the best response to challenging behavior is to wait until you can address it in person, rather than trying to resolve it through email or text messages. Sometimes it's better to wait for a private moment rather than addressing issues in front of others. I learned this lesson during a situation where a colleague made a dismissive comment about my work during a large team meeting. My immediate impulse was to defend myself and correct his mischaracterization in front of the group, but I recognized that this would likely escalate into a public argument that would be uncomfortable for everyone present. Instead, I made a brief, neutral response in the moment and then approached him privately after the meeting to address the issue directly. This allowed us to have a productive conversation about the underlying concerns without creating a spectacle or putting him in a defensive position in front of his peers. The private conversation revealed that his comment wasn't really about my work at all. He was frustrated about a completely different issue and had displaced that frustration onto an easy target. By exercising strategic patience and waiting for the right moment to address it, we were able to resolve both the immediate issue and the underlying problem that had caused it. Strategic patience is particularly valuable when dealing with people who are going through difficult personal circumstances. When someone is struggling with health issues, family problems, financial stress, or other major life challenges, their behavior may be more difficult than usual, but addressing relationship issues during these periods is often counterproductive. This doesn't mean you have to tolerate abusive or completely inappropriate behavior. It means recognizing that temporary increases in difficult behavior during crisis periods may resolve naturally once the underlying stresses are addressed. I worked with a manager whose team member became increasingly irritable and uncooperative during a period when his spouse was battling cancer. The manager's initial instinct was to address the performance issues directly and immediately, but after considering the circumstances, she decided to provide additional support and flexibility while monitoring the situation carefully. Once the medical crisis resolved and the spouse's treatment was successful, the team member's behavior returned to normal without any direct intervention. The manager's strategic patience preserved their working relationship and demonstrated compassion during a difficult time, which actually strengthened their professional bond. However, strategic patience requires clear boundaries and ongoing assessment. You need to establish limits on how long you're willing to wait and what behaviors you will and won't tolerate during the waiting period. You need to communicate these boundaries clearly when appropriate, so people understand that your patience has limits. Strategic patience also involves preparing for eventual engagement. While you're waiting for the right moment to address difficult behavior, you can use that time to gather information, develop your approach, and strengthen your position for when the conversation does happen. This might involve documenting specific incidents, consulting with colleagues or mentors about effective strategies, or simply giving yourself time to process your emotions so you can approach the situation more objectively. One of the most powerful applications of strategic patience is in dealing with people who are going through major life transitions. Starting a new job, getting divorced, dealing with the death of a loved one, or facing other significant changes can temporarily make even normally reasonable people more difficult to work with. During these transition periods, strategic patience often allows people to stabilize and return to more normal behavior patterns without requiring direct intervention. It demonstrates understanding and compassion while protecting your own emotional energy for situations that truly require immediate attention. The key insight about strategic patience is that it's not passive. It's an active choice based on strategic thinking about timing, circumstances, and optimal outcomes. It requires ongoing monitoring, clear boundaries, and the wisdom to recognize when the waiting period should end and direct engagement should begin. Strategic patience multiplies your emotional energy by ensuring that when you do invest in difficult conversations, you're doing so under conditions that maximize the likelihood of positive outcomes. It prevents you from wasting energy on confrontations that are doomed to fail because of poor timing or unfavorable circumstances. When you master strategic patience, you develop a reputation for wisdom and emotional intelligence. People begin to trust your judgment about when and how to address difficult situations, and they often seek your guidance when they're facing their own challenging relationships. Strategic patience is ultimately about playing the long game in relationships. It's about recognizing that sustainable change often takes time, and that rushing toward immediate resolution can sometimes prevent the deeper understanding and genuine improvement that comes from allowing situations to evolve naturally. The combination of elimination, automation, delegation, and strategic patience creates a comprehensive framework for managing difficult people that multiplies your emotional energy while often producing better outcomes than traditional confrontational approaches. Together, these strategies transform difficult relationships from energy drains into manageable, strategic interactions that support your overall goals and well-being. Chapter 7: The Concentration Strategy and Boundary Protection. When a difficult interaction cannot be eliminated, automated, delegated, or delayed, it drops out of the bottom of the relationship funnel into what we call the concentration phase. This is where traditional conflict resolution skills become essential, but with a crucial difference. Instead of approaching these interactions reactively, you're engaging from a position of strategic choice and emotional preparation. The concentration strategy is about the permission to protect your boundaries while engaging directly with challenging behavior. It's the art of staying focused on your core message and objectives while refusing to be drawn into emotional drama or manipulative tactics. Most people enter difficult conversations hoping to change the other person's behavior, convince them to see things differently, or get them to acknowledge their mistakes. These goals almost always lead to frustration and failure because they're focused on controlling outcomes that are fundamentally outside your influence. The concentration strategy operates from a completely different premise. Your goal isn't to change the other person. Your goal is to communicate your boundaries clearly, maintain your emotional equilibrium, and protect your interests while remaining professional and respectful. Let me share a story that illustrates this approach perfectly. I was working with a project manager who was dealing with a client who had a pattern of making last-minute changes to project requirements, demanding immediate implementation, and becoming hostile when told that changes would affect timelines or budgets. Traditional advice would suggest having a conversation about project management best practices, explaining why last-minute changes are problematic, or trying to educate the client about reasonable expectations. But all of these approaches focus on changing the client's behavior, which is outside the project manager's control. Instead, we developed a concentration strategy focused on boundary protection. The next time the client made an unreasonable demand, the project manager responded with a clear, calm statement of the situation and options. I understand you'd like to implement this change immediately. Based on our current timeline and resources, I can offer you 3 options. We can implement the change with a 2-week delay to the final delivery. We can implement a simplified version within the current timeline. Or we can discuss adjusting the budget to bring in additional resources for faster implementation. Which option works best for your priorities? This response accomplished several important things. It acknowledged the client's request without agreeing to unreasonable terms. It provided clear options with transparent consequences. It put the decision-making responsibility back on the client rather than making the project manager responsible for solving an impossible problem. Most importantly, it protected the project manager's boundaries while maintaining a professional relationship. The client couldn't claim that their request was being ignored or dismissed, but they also couldn't force the project manager to accept unreasonable demands. The concentration strategy requires developing what I call emotional armor. This isn't about becoming cold or unfeeling. It's about creating psychological protection that allows you to engage with difficult people without absorbing their emotional dysfunction. Emotional armor consists of several key components. First is clarity about your own values, priorities, and non-negotiable boundaries. When you're crystal clear about what you will and won't accept, it becomes much easier to respond consistently to challenging behavior. Second is the ability to separate other people's emotions from your own. When someone is angry, frustrated, or upset, their emotional state doesn't have to become your emotional state. You can acknowledge their feelings without taking responsibility for managing them. Third is the skill of staying focused on facts and outcomes rather than getting drawn into emotional arguments. When someone tries to make a conversation about personalities, blame, or past grievances, you can consistently redirect to specific behaviors and practical solutions. The concentration strategy also involves mastering what I call broken record communication. This technique involves identifying your core message and repeating it consistently, regardless of how the other person tries to derail or manipulate the conversation. For example, if someone is pressuring you to take on additional work that you don't have capacity for, your broken record message might be, "I understand this is important to you. My current commitments mean I can take this on starting next month, or we can discuss which of my current priorities should be delayed to accommodate this request." No matter how they argue, plead, guilt trip, or try to convince you that their request is more urgent than your existing commitments, you return to this same core message. You're not being stubborn or unreasonable. You're being consistent and clear about reality. One of the most challenging aspects of the concentration strategy is learning to tolerate other people's disappointment or frustration without feeling compelled to fix it. Many of us have been conditioned to believe that if someone is upset with our boundaries, we need to adjust those boundaries to make them feel better. This conditioning is particularly strong for people who were raised in families where they learned to manage other people's emotions as a survival strategy. If you grew up walking on eggshells around a volatile parent, or if you learned that your worth was tied to keeping others happy, the concentration strategy can feel uncomfortable at first. But learning to tolerate other people's negative emotions without taking responsibility for them is essential for maintaining healthy boundaries with difficult people. Their disappointment, frustration, or anger about your boundaries is information about their expectations, not evidence that your boundaries are wrong. The concentration strategy also requires developing comfort with silence and pauses in conversation. Difficult people often use rapid-fire arguments, emotional outbursts, or pressure tactics to overwhelm your ability to think clearly and respond thoughtfully. By learning to pause, breathe, and take time to formulate your response, you maintain control over the conversation's pace and your own emotional state. You might say something like, "That's a lot of information. Let me take a moment to think about what you've shared." Then you take the time you need to respond thoughtfully rather than reactively. This approach often disrupts the emotional momentum that difficult people rely on to get their way. When you refuse to be rushed or pressured, you force the conversation back to a more rational, problem-solving mode. The concentration strategy is particularly important when dealing with people who use guilt, manipulation, or emotional blackmail to get what they want. These tactics are designed to make you feel responsible for their emotions and compel you to give in to their demands to relieve your own discomfort. A typical guilt-based manipulation might sound like, "I can't believe you're not willing to help me with this. I thought we were friends. I've always been there for you when you needed something." A concentration strategy response focuses on the specific request rather than the emotional manipulation. "I value our friendship, which is why I want to be honest with you about what I can and can't commit to right now. I'm not available to help with this project, but I'd be happy to brainstorm other resources or solutions that might work for you." This response acknowledges the relationship without accepting responsibility for their emotional reaction to your boundary. It offers alternative support without compromising your own needs or commitments. The concentration strategy also involves learning to end conversations that become unproductive or abusive. You always have the right to disengage from interactions that are disrespectful, manipulative, or harmful, regardless of the other person's position or relationship to you. This might sound like, "I can see we're both getting frustrated, and this conversation isn't moving us toward a solution. Let's take a break and revisit this when we can approach it more constructively." Then you physically remove yourself from the situation, even if the other person wants to continue arguing. the key to successful concentration is preparation. Before engaging in a difficult conversation, you should be clear about your objectives, your boundaries, and your alternatives. You should have practiced your key messages and thought through likely scenarios and your responses to them. This preparation isn't about scripting every word, but about having a clear framework that you can rely on when emotions run high or when you're faced with unexpected tactics. The concentration strategy transforms difficult conversations from emotional battlegrounds into professional negotiations. It allows you to engage with challenging people while protecting your own well-being and maintaining your integrity. When you master the concentration strategy, you develop a reputation for being someone who can handle difficult situations with grace and effectiveness. People begin to trust you with challenging conversations because they know you won't escalate conflicts or compromise important principles. Most importantly, the concentration strategy allows you to engage with difficult people without becoming difficult yourself. It preserves your emotional energy and professional relationships while ensuring that your boundaries are respected and your objectives are achieved. Chapter 8: The Psychology Behind Difficult Behavior. To effectively implement the relationship funnel strategies, it's crucial to understand the psychological drivers behind difficult behavior. Most challenging personalities aren't simply choosing to be difficult for the sake of causing problems. Their behavior usually serves specific psychological functions, and understanding these functions can help you respond more strategically and with greater compassion. The first category of difficult behavior stems from what psychologists call attachment insecurity. People with insecure attachment styles often developed their behavioral patterns as survival strategies during childhood, when they learned that certain behaviors were necessary to get their needs met or to feel safe in relationships. For example, someone who becomes aggressive or demanding when they feel ignored may have learned early in life that being loud and persistent was the only way to get attention from overwhelmed or distracted caregivers. Their adult behavior, while problematic, is an attempt to recreate a strategy that once worked for them. Understanding this doesn't mean you should tolerate inappropriate behavior, but it can help you respond with less personal reactivity. When you recognize that someone's difficult behavior is driven by deep-seated fears about being overlooked or abandoned, you can address their underlying need for acknowledgement while still maintaining your boundaries. I worked with a team leader who had a colleague that would interrupt meetings, dominate conversations, and become visibly agitated when others were speaking. Initially, the team leader interpreted this behavior as arrogance or disrespect. But after learning about attachment psychology, she began to see it as anxiety-driven behavior from someone who feared being overlooked or having their contributions minimized. This understanding allowed her to develop a more effective response strategy. Instead of trying to shut down the interrupting behavior directly, she began each meeting by explicitly asking for this person's input on key agenda items. This proactive acknowledgement satisfied their need for recognition and significantly reduced their disruptive behavior during the rest of the meeting. The second major category of difficult behavior is what I call control compensation. Many challenging personalities are driven by an underlying sense of powerlessness or lack of control in their lives. Their difficult behavior is an attempt to exert control in whatever areas they can influence. This often manifests as micromanaging, excessive criticism, rigid adherence to rules or procedures, or creating unnecessary complications around simple tasks. The person isn't trying to make your life difficult. They're trying to create a sense of control and predictability in their environment. A classic example is the colleague who insists on being copied on every email, wants to review every document before it's sent, and questions every decision that's made without their input. This behavior often stems from anxiety about being out of the loop or losing influence, rather than from genuine concerns about quality or accuracy. When you understand that control-seeking behavior is usually driven by anxiety rather than malice, you can develop strategies that address the underlying need while protecting your own autonomy. This might involve providing regular updates, including them in planning discussions, or giving them ownership over specific areas where their need for control can be channeled productively. The third category is validation-seeking behavior. Some difficult people have learned that creating drama, conflict, or crisis is an effective way to get attention and feel important. They may unconsciously escalate minor issues into major problems because the resulting attention and activity makes them feel valued and central to the organization. This type of difficult behavior often includes constant complaining, creating urgency around non-urgent issues, or positioning themselves as indispensable by being the only person who can handle certain crisis situations that they often create themselves. I encountered this pattern with a team member who would regularly discover critical problems late on Friday afternoons that required immediate attention and weekend work. Initially, I responded to these crises with the urgency they seemed to demand, but over time, I noticed that these emergencies often turned out to be less critical than initially presented, and that they followed a predictable pattern of timing and escalation. Once I recognized the validation-seeking pattern, I was able to respond more strategically. Instead of immediately dropping everything to address each crisis, I began asking specific questions about timelines, consequences, and alternatives. I also started scheduling regular check-ins with this person to provide the attention and recognition they were seeking through more constructive channels. The fourth category is emotional regulation difficulties. Some people never learned healthy ways to manage stress, frustration, or disappointment. Their difficult behavior represents their best attempt to cope with overwhelming emotions, even though their strategies are ineffective and often counterproductive. This might manifest as explosive anger over minor issues, passive-aggressive behavior when they're frustrated, or emotional withdrawal when they feel criticized or overwhelmed. These individuals aren't choosing to be difficult, they're using the only emotional regulation tools they have available. Understanding this can help you respond with greater patience and strategic thinking. Instead of taking their emotional outbursts personally or trying to logic them out of their feelings, you can focus on helping them return to a more regulated emotional state before attempting to address the underlying issues. This might involve giving them time and space to calm down, acknowledging their emotions without agreeing with their interpretation of events, or helping them break down overwhelming situations into more manageable components. The fifth category is what I call learned helplessness compensation. Some difficult people have experienced situations where they felt powerless and unable to influence important outcomes. As a result, they may overcompensate by trying to control everything they can or by becoming overly dependent on others to solve their problems. This can manifest as either micromanaging behavior or as learned helplessness, where they consistently present problems without solutions and expect others to take responsibility for fixing their difficulties. A manager I worked with had an employee who would bring every minor challenge to her attention, expecting her to provide detailed solutions and step-by-step guidance for routine tasks. Initially, she interpreted this as laziness or lack of initiative, but she eventually recognized it as a pattern of learned helplessness, where the employee had been conditioned to believe they couldn't solve problems independently. The solution involved gradually building the employee's confidence and problem-solving skills by asking questions that guided them toward their own solutions, rather than providing immediate answers. This approach took more time initially, but ultimately created a more capable and independent team member. Understanding the psychology behind difficult behavior also helps you recognize when someone's challenging patterns are likely to be temporary versus chronic. Behavior that's driven by temporary stressors, life transitions, or specific situational factors is more likely to improve naturally over time. Behavior that's rooted in deep personality patterns or unresolved psychological issues may require more long-term strategic management. This understanding can inform your decisions about which relationship funnel strategy to apply. Temporary difficult behavior might be best handled through strategic patience, while chronic patterns might require automation or delegation strategies. The psychological insight also helps you maintain emotional objectivity when dealing with challenging people. When you understand that their behavior is driven by their own psychological needs and limitations, rather than by a desire to make your life difficult, it becomes easier to respond strategically rather than reactively. This doesn't mean you should become an amateur therapist or take responsibility for fixing other people's psychological issues. But understanding the underlying drivers can help you respond more effectively and with less personal stress. The key insight is that difficult behavior usually makes sense from the other person's perspective, even when it seems irrational or counterproductive to you. They're using strategies that have worked for them in the past or that feel necessary for their psychological safety, even when those strategies are no longer effective or appropriate. When you can see difficult behavior through this lens, it becomes easier to respond with strategic thinking rather than emotional reactivity. You can address the behavior that's impacting you while having compassion for the underlying struggles that may be driving it. This psychological understanding also helps you recognize when your own triggers and patterns might be contributing to difficult dynamics. Sometimes, what we perceive as difficult behavior in others is actually a reaction to our own communication style, expectations, or emotional state. By developing greater self-awareness alongside your understanding of others' psychology, you can become more effective at preventing difficult interactions and creating more positive relationship dynamics overall. Chapter 9. Building Emotional Resilience and Mental Armor. The most successful boundary multipliers don't just have good strategies for dealing with difficult people, they have developed what I call emotional resilience that allows them to maintain their equilibrium and effectiveness even in the most challenging interpersonal situations. This resilience isn't something you're born with. It's a set of skills and mindsets that can be developed through intentional practice. Emotional resilience is like physical fitness for your psychological well-being. Just as regular exercise builds your body's ability to handle physical stress and recover from exertion, emotional resilience training builds your mind's ability to handle interpersonal stress and recover from difficult interactions. The foundation of emotional resilience is what psychologists call emotional regulation. This is your ability to recognize, understand, and manage your own emotional responses, particularly in challenging situations. Most people experience emotions as things that happen to them, but emotional regulation involves learning to see emotions as information that you can evaluate and respond to strategically. When someone criticizes your work unfairly, your initial emotional response might be anger, hurt, or defensiveness. These emotions are natural and valid, but they don't have to dictate your behavior. Emotional regulation allows you to acknowledge these feelings while choosing a response that serves your long-term interests rather than just providing immediate emotional relief. I learned this lesson during a particularly challenging project where a stakeholder would regularly send emails questioning my competence, criticizing my decisions, and copying senior leadership on his complaints. My initial responses were defensive and detailed, trying to justify every decision and prove that his criticisms were unfounded. These defensive responses not only took enormous amounts of time and emotional energy, they actually made me look less competent to the senior leaders who were copied on the exchanges. My detailed justifications came across as insecurity rather than confidence. Once I developed better emotional regulation skills, I was able to recognize my defensive impulses without acting on them immediately. Instead of responding to the emotional content of his emails, I began responding only to specific, actionable requests buried within his complaints. I acknowledged his concerns briefly and professionally, then focused on moving projects forward rather than relitigating past decisions. This approach required me to tolerate the discomfort of not defending myself against unfair criticism, but it ultimately led to much better outcomes. The stakeholders' complaints became less frequent and less inflammatory when they stopped generating the defensive reactions he was seeking. Senior leadership began to see me as someone who could handle difficult situations with professionalism rather than someone who got drawn into unnecessary conflicts. The second component of emotional resilience is developing what I call perspective flexibility. This is the ability to view challenging situations from multiple angles and to maintain a broader perspective even when you're in the middle of a difficult interaction. Most people, when they're dealing with a difficult person, become completely focused on the immediate situation. They lose sight of their larger goals, their other relationships, and the temporary nature of most interpersonal challenges. This tunnel vision makes every difficult interaction feel more significant and more threatening than it actually is. Perspective flexibility involves regularly stepping back and asking yourself questions like, how important will this interaction be in a week, in a month, in a year? What are my real priorities here? And how does this situation relate to those priorities? What would I advise a friend who was dealing with this same situation? These questions help you maintain emotional equilibrium by reminding you that most difficult interactions are temporary inconveniences rather than existential threats. They help you allocate your emotional energy proportionally to the actual significance of the situation. I developed this skill during a period when I was dealing with a chronically negative colleague who seemed to find fault with every project, every decision, and every suggestion that came from our team. Initially, his constant criticism felt like a personal attack and a threat to my professional reputation. But when I began practicing perspective flexibility, I realized that his negativity was actually having very little impact on our team's success or my career progression. His complaints were largely ignored by leadership, and his negative attitude was more of a source of eye-rolling than serious concern among our colleagues. This perspective shift allowed me to stop taking his behavior personally and to respond more strategically. Instead of trying to convince him to be more positive or defending against his criticisms, I simply focused on doing good work and maintaining positive relationships with the people who actually influenced important decisions. The third component of emotional resilience is what I call energy management. This involves recognizing that your emotional energy is a finite resource that needs to be protected and allocated strategically, just like your time or money. Many people approach difficult relationships as if they have unlimited emotional capacity. They engage with every challenging person, respond to every provocation, and try to solve every interpersonal problem they encounter. This approach inevitably leads to emotional exhaustion and decreased effectiveness in all areas of life. Energy management involves making conscious decisions about where to invest your emotional resources based on your priorities and the likelihood of positive outcomes. It means recognizing that saying yes to one difficult interaction means saying no to other activities that might be more important or fulfilling. This might involve setting specific limits on how much time you'll spend dealing with certain challenging people, or establishing boundaries around when and how you'll engage with difficult behavior. It might mean choosing to invest heavily in resolving one important difficult relationship while using minimal energy strategies for less significant interpersonal challenges. The fourth component is developing what I call outcome independence. This is the ability to engage with difficult people while remaining emotionally detached from specific outcomes. Instead of needing the other person to change, agree with you, or respond positively, you focus on communicating clearly and maintaining your own integrity regardless of their response. Outcome independence is particularly important when dealing with people who use emotional manipulation or guilt tactics to get their way. When you're emotionally attached to getting a specific response from them, you become vulnerable to these tactics. When you're focused on your own behavior and communication rather than their response, you maintain your power and effectiveness. I learned this during a situation where I needed to set boundaries with a family member who had a pattern of making unreasonable demands and becoming hostile when those demands weren't met. For years, I had tried various approaches to get them to understand why their requests were problematic and to change their behavior. Once I developed outcome independence, I stopped trying to get them to understand or agree with my boundaries. I simply communicated my limits clearly and consistently, regardless of their emotional response. This approach was initially uncomfortable because they escalated their emotional tactics when their usual strategies stopped working. But over time, they learned that emotional manipulation was no longer an effective way to influence my decisions. Our relationship became more respectful and less dramatic because I was no longer participating in the emotional cycles that had previously characterized our interactions. The fifth component of emotional resilience is what I call recovery rituals. These are specific practices that help you restore your emotional equilibrium after difficult interactions and prevent the stress from accumulating over time. Recovery rituals might include physical activities like exercise or walking, creative activities like music or art, social activities like spending time with supportive friends, or solitary activities like meditation or reading. The key is having intentional practices that help you process difficult emotions and return to a positive emotional state. Many people underestimate the importance of recovery rituals and try to move directly from difficult interactions to other demanding activities. This approach leads to emotional accumulation, where the stress from multiple difficult interactions builds up over time and eventually impacts your overall well-being and effectiveness. I developed a recovery ritual of taking a brief walk after any particularly challenging conversation or meeting. This physical movement helped me process the emotional energy from the interaction and transition to a more positive mindset before engaging with other people or tasks. The walk also gave me time to reflect on what went well during the interaction, what I might do differently next time, and what I learned about the other person or the situation. This reflection helped me extract value from difficult experiences rather than just enduring them. Building emotional resilience is an ongoing process that requires consistent practice and attention. Like physical fitness, it's something that needs to be maintained through regular exercise and healthy habits. But the investment pays enormous dividends in your ability to handle challenging people and situations with grace, effectiveness, and minimal personal stress. When you develop strong emotional resilience, you become someone that others turn to during difficult situations because they know you can handle challenges without becoming part of the problem. You become more effective in all areas of your life because you're not constantly drained by interpersonal drama and conflict. Most importantly, emotional resilience allows you to maintain your own values, integrity, and well-being even when you're surrounded by difficult people or challenging circumstances. It gives you the freedom to choose your responses based on your principles and goals rather than being reactive to other people's behavior and emotions. Chapter 10. Advanced Boundary Setting Techniques. Effective boundary setting is both an art and a science, requiring a deep understanding of human psychology, clear communication skills, and the emotional strength to maintain your limits even when others push against them. Most people think of boundaries as walls that keep others out, but healthy boundaries are more like permeable membranes that allow positive interactions while filtering out harmful or draining behavior. The first principle of advanced boundary setting is understanding the difference between boundaries and ultimatums. Boundaries are statements about your own behavior and limits. I don't discuss work issues after 8 p.m. or I need 24 hours notice for non-emergency requests. Ultimatums are attempts to control other people's behavior. You need to stop calling me after hours, or you have to give me more notice. This distinction is crucial because you can only control your own actions, not other people's choices. When you frame boundaries as statements about your own behavior, you maintain your power and avoid getting into arguments about what other people should or shouldn't do. I learned this lesson while working with a client who had a habit of sending urgent requests late at night and expecting immediate responses. My initial approach was to ask him to stop sending late-night emails, which led to arguments about what constituted a true emergency and whether my response expectations were reasonable. When I shifted to a boundary-based approach, I simply stated, I check email twice daily at 9 a.m. and 4 p.m. If you have a true emergency outside those times, please call my phone directly. This boundary was about my behavior, not his. He could still send late-night emails if he wanted to, but he now understood when he could expect a response. This approach eliminated the arguments because there was nothing for him to negotiate or push against. I wasn't trying to control his behavior. I was simply being clear about my own availability and response patterns. The second principle is what I call graduated boundaries. Instead of going from no limits to rigid walls, effective boundary setting often involves a progression of increasingly clear limits that give people opportunities to adjust their behavior before more serious consequences are implemented. For example, if you're dealing with someone who frequently interrupts you during meetings, your graduated boundary progression might look like this. First level: I'd like to finish my thought before hearing your perspective. Second level: I notice we're having trouble with interruptions today. Let's try to let each person complete their points before responding. Third level: I'm going to need to ask that we respect speaking turns, or we'll need to table this discussion for a time when we can communicate more effectively. This progression gives the other person multiple opportunities to adjust their behavior while making it clear that continued interruptions will have consequences. It also demonstrates that you're being reasonable and fair rather than immediately jumping to harsh measures. The third principle is boundary consistency. One of the biggest mistakes people make is setting boundaries they're not prepared to maintain consistently. If you establish a limit but then make exceptions when people push against it, you're actually teaching them that your boundaries are negotiable and that persistence will eventually get them what they want. Consistency doesn't mean rigidity. You can have different boundaries for different people based on your relationship with them and the context of your interactions. But whatever boundaries you set for a particular person or situation need to be maintained predictably, or they lose their effectiveness. I worked with a manager who was struggling with an employee who would regularly show up late to meetings and then expect everyone to catch him up on what he had missed. The manager would sometimes address this behavior and sometimes ignore it, depending on her mood and the importance of the meeting. This inconsistency actually made the problem worse because the employee learned that lateness sometimes had consequences and sometimes didn't, which created a variable reinforcement schedule that actually strengthened the problematic behavior. When the manager began consistently addressing lateness every single time it occurred, using the same calm professional response, the behavior changed quickly. The employee realized that lateness would always have consequences, so it was no longer worth the risk. The fourth principle is emotional neutrality in boundary enforcement. When people push against your boundaries, they often do so with emotional intensity, hoping to make you feel guilty, angry, or uncomfortable enough to give in. Effective boundary setting requires maintaining emotional neutrality even when others are being dramatic or manipulative. This doesn't mean being cold or unfeeling. It means staying focused on the facts and the boundaries themselves rather than getting drawn into emotional arguments about whether your limits are fair, reasonable, or convenient for others. A typical boundary-pushing interaction might sound like, "I can't believe you won't make an exception just this once. This is really important, and you're being completely unreasonable. I thought we had a good working relationship." An emotionally neutral boundary enforcement response would be, "I understand this is important to you. My policy is to require 48 hours notice for schedule changes, and I'm not able to make an exception in this case. I can accommodate your request if you'd like to reschedule for next week." This response acknowledges their feelings without taking responsibility for them, restates the boundary clearly, and offers an alternative that respects both their needs and your limits. The fifth principle is proactive boundary communication. Instead of waiting for problems to arise and then trying to set boundaries reactively, effective boundary setters communicate their limits clearly and early in relationships or projects. This might involve having conversations about communication preferences when you start working with someone new, establishing meeting protocols at the beginning of a project, or clarifying availability and response times when taking on new responsibilities. Proactive boundary communication prevents many problems from developing and makes it easier to maintain your limits because people understand the expectations from the beginning, rather than feeling like you're changing the rules in the middle of the game. The sixth principle is what I call boundary flexibility within structure. While consistency is important, effective boundaries also need to accommodate legitimate exceptions and changing circumstances. The key is having clear criteria for when flexibility is appropriate and communicating those criteria clearly. For example, you might have a boundary about not taking work calls during family dinner time, but you could specify that you'll make exceptions for true emergencies involving client safety or major system failures. By defining what constitutes a legitimate exception, you maintain the integrity of your boundary while allowing for necessary flexibility. The seventh principle is consequence clarity. Effective boundaries include clear, reasonable consequences that you're prepared to implement if the boundary is violated. These consequences should be proportional to the violation and focused on protecting your interests rather than punishing the other person. If someone consistently violates your communication boundaries, the consequence might be that you'll only communicate with them through email rather than phone calls. If someone repeatedly shows up unprepared to meetings, the consequence might be that you'll reschedule when they're not ready to participate effectively. The key is choosing consequences that you can implement without requiring the other person's cooperation or agreement. You can't make someone respect your boundaries, but you can control your own responses to boundary violations. Advanced boundary setting also involves understanding the difference between boundaries and preferences. Preferences are things you'd like but can live without. Boundaries are limits that you need to maintain for your well-being, effectiveness, or integrity. It's important to be clear about which is which, both for yourself and in your communication with others. When you present preferences as boundaries, you undermine your credibility and make it harder to maintain your actual limits. When you fail to recognize your true boundaries, you end up compromising your well-being in ways that ultimately hurt both you and your relationships. The final principle is boundary evolution. As you grow and change, and as your circumstances evolve, your boundaries may need to be adjusted. What worked in one phase of your career or life might not be appropriate for your current situation. Regular reflection on your boundaries and their effectiveness is important for maintaining healthy relationships and protecting your well-being over time. This might involve tightening some boundaries that aren't serving you well, relaxing others that are no longer necessary, or developing new boundaries to address emerging challenges. Effective boundary setting is ultimately about creating the conditions for healthy, productive relationships while protecting your own well-being and effectiveness. When done skillfully, boundaries actually improve relationships by creating clarity, reducing conflict, and allowing people to interact with confidence about expectations and limits. People who master advanced boundary setting techniques often find that their relationships become more respectful, their stress levels decrease significantly, and their overall effectiveness increases because they're no longer constantly managing other people's inappropriate behavior or unreasonable demands. Chapter 11. Transforming Workplace Dynamics. The workplace presents unique challenges when it comes to managing difficult people because you often can't simply eliminate these relationships from your life. You have to find ways to work effectively with challenging colleagues, demanding bosses, difficult clients, and problematic team members while maintaining your professional reputation and achieving your career goals. The key to transforming workplace dynamics is understanding that organizational culture is created through the accumulation of individual interactions and behavioral patterns. Every time you respond to difficult behavior, you're either reinforcing existing dysfunctional patterns or modeling healthier alternatives that can gradually shift the overall culture. Most people approach workplace difficult people as isolated problems to be solved individually. But boundary multipliers understand that workplace relationships exist within systems, and that changing your approach to one difficult person often has ripple effects that improve multiple relationships and overall team dynamics. Let me illustrate this with a story about a marketing team that was struggling with what they called meeting hijacking. Several team members had developed a pattern of using team meetings to air personal grievances, relitigate past decisions, and engage in lengthy debates about issues that weren't on the agenda. These hijacked meetings were frustrating for everyone involved. They ran long, accomplished little, and left team members feeling like their time was being wasted. The team leader had tried various approaches, creating more detailed agendas, asking people to stay on topic, and even having individual conversations with the worst offenders. Nothing seemed to work until she implemented a systematic approach based on the relationship funnel principles. Instead of trying to control everyone's behavior, she focused on creating structural changes that would naturally discourage problematic behavior while encouraging more productive interactions. First, she implemented what she called agenda discipline. Every meeting would have a clearly defined agenda with time allocations for each topic. Any issues that weren't on the agenda would be added to a parking lot list to be addressed at the end of the meeting if time allowed, or scheduled for future discussion. Second, she established role clarity for meetings. She designated specific people to serve as timekeeper, note-taker, and agenda facilitator for each meeting, rotating these roles among team members. This distributed responsibility for meeting effectiveness and gave everyone a stake in maintaining productive discussions. Third, she created alternative channels for the types of issues that were previously hijacking meetings. She established regular office hours for individual concerns, monthly team retrospectives for process improvements, and quarterly strategic discussions for big-picture issues. The transformation was remarkable. Within a month, meetings became significantly more focused and productive. Team members began to appreciate the structure because it allowed them to accomplish more in less time. The people who had previously been the worst meeting hijackers actually became some of the strongest supporters of the new system because they realized they were getting better outcomes for their concerns through the appropriate channels. This example illustrates several key principles for transforming workplace dynamics. First, systemic problems often require systemic solutions rather than individual interventions. Second, creating positive structures is often more effective than trying to eliminate negative behaviors. Third, giving people appropriate outlets for their concerns can reduce problematic behavior in inappropriate settings. The principle of positive structure creation is particularly powerful in workplace settings. Instead of focusing on what you don't want people to do, you create systems and processes that naturally encourage the behaviors you do want to see. For example, if you're dealing with a colleague who frequently sends unclear or incomplete requests that require multiple follow-up conversations, you might create a standard request template that includes all the necessary information. Instead of repeatedly asking them to be more thorough, you provide a structure that makes thoroughness easier and more natural. If you're managing a team member who struggles with prioritization and frequently works on low-value tasks while important deadlines approach, you might implement weekly priority setting meetings where you collaboratively review their task list and establish clear priorities for the coming week. These structural approaches are often more effective than direct feedback because they address the underlying systems that enable problematic behavior rather than just asking people to change their habits through willpower alone. Another key principle for workplace transformation is what I call alliance building. Instead of trying to manage difficult people in isolation, you can often be more effective by building alliances with colleagues who share your concerns and working together to create positive change. This doesn't mean gossiping about difficult people or creating factions within your workplace. It means identifying others who are also affected by problematic behavior and collaborating on constructive solutions that benefit everyone. I worked with a project team that was struggling with a colleague who had a pattern of agreeing to deadlines in meetings but then consistently delivering work late without advance notice. This behavior was affecting the entire team's ability to meet client commitments and was creating stress for everyone involved. Instead of each team member dealing with this issue individually, they decided to address it collectively. They implemented a shared project tracking system that made everyone's deadlines and progress visible to the entire team. They also established a protocol for early warning when deadlines were at risk, with specific escalation procedures for addressing delays. This collaborative approach was more effective than individual conversations because it created accountability through transparency and peer pressure rather than relying on top-down management. The colleague with deadline issues couldn't claim that they didn't understand expectations or that their delays weren't affecting others because the impact was visible to everyone. The alliance-building approach also works for dealing with difficult bosses or senior colleagues. If multiple people are experiencing similar challenges with a demanding or unreasonable leader, they can sometimes work together to address the issues more effectively than any individual could alone. This might involve collectively proposing process improvements, sharing strategies for managing the difficult behavior, or even approaching HR or senior leadership together when individual efforts have been unsuccessful. The key to effective alliance building is focusing on constructive solutions rather than just complaining about problems. When you approach colleagues with specific ideas for improvement rather than just venting about frustrations, you're more likely to build productive partnerships and create positive change. Another important principle for workplace transformation is modeling the behavior you want to see. Difficult workplace dynamics often persist because they become normalized through repetition. When everyone accepts that meetings will run long, that certain people will be consistently late, or that some colleagues will be regularly disrespectful, these behaviors become part of the organizational culture. By consistently modeling professional, respectful, and effective behavior, you can begin to shift these norms. This doesn't mean being perfect or never making mistakes. It means being intentional about demonstrating the standards you want to see in your workplace. For example, if you want meetings to start on time, you can make a point of always arriving promptly and being ready to begin at the scheduled time. If you want more respectful communication, you can consistently use professional language and tone even when others are being difficult. This modeling approach often has more impact than direct confrontation because it provides a positive alternative rather than just criticism of existing behavior. People can see what better looks like rather than just being told what they're doing wrong. The principle of strategic visibility is also important for workplace transformation. Many difficult workplace behaviors persist because they happen in private or in small groups where there's limited accountability. By strategically increasing the visibility of interactions, you can often reduce problematic behavior without direct confrontation. This might involve including additional people in email conversations, scheduling meetings in open areas rather than private offices, or documenting decisions and agreements in writing rather than relying on verbal commitments. For example, if you're dealing with a colleague who makes commitments in private conversations but then claims they never agreed to those commitments, you might start following up private discussions with email summaries. Thanks for our conversation today. Just to confirm, you'll have the budget analysis completed by Friday and I'll provide the client feedback by Wednesday. This approach protects you from future disputes while also creating accountability that often prevents the problematic behavior from occurring in the first place. The final principle for workplace transformation is patience with progress. Changing workplace dynamics takes time, especially when you're dealing with long-established patterns and multiple difficult personalities. It's important to celebrate small improvements and maintain your commitment to positive change, even when progress feels slow. Workplace transformation is ultimately about creating an environment where everyone can be more effective and professional. When you successfully implement these principles, you often find that people who seemed impossible to work with become more reasonable and collaborative when they're operating within better systems and clearer expectations. The goal isn't to change difficult people's personalities, but to create conditions where their challenging traits have less negative impact and where their positive qualities can be better utilized. This approach benefits everyone, including the difficult people themselves, who often perform better when they have clearer structure and more appropriate outlets for their concerns and energy.